Here are the three biggest mistakes I see people making with 90-90. 90-90 became a super popular position and setup for people to get into, claiming to improve hip mobility. One of the biggest issues I see with 90-90 is not fully understanding what we're actually trying to get out of the hip joint. So the very first thing we're going to look at is the 90-90 setup as a whole and break down the elements of the position and what we're looking for in that setup. First and foremost, this is the 90-90 position. You'll see a lot of people say, well, this is 90-92. But this is something also known as shin box. You don't have a 90-degree angle here, you don't have a 90-degree angle here, and there's not a 90-degree angle here. You may have somewhat of a 90-degree angle here, but we're looking to open the hips a little bit more, and we're being very specific. Shin box has its value, and it's an important setup that I like to utilize as well, but 90-90 is a specific position that I like to get specific inputs out of. So with 90-90, we're looking for a 90-degree angle here. We're looking for also a 90-degree angle here. And so in this position, it provides us with a variety of ways in which we can stretch the hips and also train the hips. Let's start with the front side. So in the front hip, what we can look at is hip adduction as well as hip external rotation. Right now in this position, the hip is in a great degree of external rotation. It's also in a certain amount of adduction. So we can train both of those specific positions from this 90-90 position. But what we have to understand is that might be limited by this back hip depending on the person. If it's not comfortable here, the person may not be able to set up in 90-90 and get the input we want or get the stretch that we want out of this front hip. So we may have to make adjustments. One of the ways in which we can make an adjustment is to pitch to the side. Pitching to the side alleviates some of the abduction on this hip, which also alleviates some of what somebody might feel is a pinchy sensation or kind of a restriction in this part of the hip right here. But for some people who have a decent amount of hip mobility, this setup might be a decent position for them to start from. Also, we should consider the amount of external rotation in this front hip. Most people don't have this amount of external rotation of the front hip to begin with, or control of that, or even range there. So you're already at a fairly large amount of stretch in external rotation. Now, in this position, what we're looking for is posterior capsule stretch. And if we're not getting a stretch in this position right now, we can change our body position in order to generate a little bit of a stretch sensation in the back part of the hip. If you're already experiencing a stretch, then that's totally fine. But one of the ways in which we can figure out how to get the stretch that we're looking for is to play around with the pelvic position. We can imagine we have a belt buckle on the front of our pants, and we point that belt buckle towards the floor, bringing the tailbone up in the back. So imagining taking that tailbone, arching the low back, creating length on the back of the tissue of this hip. So you might find a stretch there. You might also want to shift side to side. So you're trying to shift the pelvis around from one side to the other. So shifting this way or shifting further to that direction to find a little bit more stretch in the posterior part of the hip. We can also imagine bringing our belt buckle forward or bringing our belly button forward over the hip a little bit or over the knee a little bit further. So we don't want to just collapse in the spine here because that's a spine movement. We want to imagine lengthening and bringing the belt buckle forward, changing the angle here between the hip and the abdomen, right? So if we round through the spine, then that's spinal flexion. We're not looking for spinal flexion. What we're looking for is stretch of the posterior capsule of the hip tissue. So bring the belly button forward, you might get more of a stretch there. From there, we can imagine two things. We can try and get more abduction, so meaning we can imagine trying to bring this entire shin bone towards our torso, so trying to close this angle between our abdomen and our thigh. So you can engage the tissue on the front side of the joint to do that, right? So that's trying to close this angle down or trying to create more adduction to the midsection. Or we can try and drive abduction towards the floor, driving away, so taking the knee and ankle at the same time and trying to drive this entire shin bone down towards the floor, and that should activate the back side of the hip. You should feel the back side of the hip working to drive down, and when you're pulling forward, you should feel the front side of the hip trying to pull upward. Now, if we're looking at the rotation of the hip joint, we can think about how this bone would rotate and what that would do to this shin bone, right? So if this bone were to try and rotate towards this direction, so if we're trying to rotate the bone this direction towards my inner thigh, then that would make the outside of the foot heavy on the floor. And so that would be trying to increase internal rotation. You're in external rotation trying to go into internal rotation, but you're blocked by the floor and unable to do that. We don't want to lift the knee while we're doing that. We want to keep the knee in the same place, imagining this bone here, our femur, is on a rotisserie and just trying to rotate. That contraction to try and drive into the floor, we should also feel a contraction of the tissue in the backside of the hip. To reverse that and try and squeeze out more external rotation, we would imagine rotating this femur, this bone, this direction towards our outside, which would be trying to increase more external rotation of the hip. Now the foot shouldn't lift off the floor, or it wouldn't lift off the floor because you're at your in range, but you should imagine trying to make the outside of the foot light against the floor, as if you're trying to slide a piece of paper down through there. You can drive into the floor as well, and you'll feel this inner thigh stuff contracting, but you also might feel a stretch in the back side of the hip for that. So that's abduction, adduction, as well as internal, external rotation, isometrics in this position here from 90-90. Now, the thing is, the back hip can also be trained. So when we look at the back hip, oftentimes what people neglect is they're saying, oh, I'm going to do some rotation here, but what we can do in order to increase the internal rotation of this back hip is we can open up towards this back hip. So we open up towards the back hip, and we're looking for a stretch here in the back of the hip. So this bone, the femur, you want to feel it getting heavy into the posterior capsule back there. And once you find that stretch, that's the tissue we want. This is the tissue we want to stretch. If you feel any sensation there in the knee joint, then we can address that in another way by setting up in a different position. But for most people, or for a lot of people, you can find that stretch in the back of the hip, and you can also pitch away or lean away. That should create a little bit of an opening here, because if you're more upright, you might feel a little bit of sensation here and not get the stretch in the back of the hip, which is what we want. We don't want stuff here. That's not what we're looking for. And if you don't have enough space in the joint, we're just pinching in the femur to the pelvis by being more upright. So if we pitch away just a little bit, we might be able to rotate a little bit more and find a little bit more stretch in the back part of the hip there. From there, what we can do is we can begin our isometrics going the opposite way. So we can get heavy on the instep of the foot, and we're trying to create external rotation. So imagining rotating this bone this direction. So rotating the bone this direction, getting heavy on the foot here, and trying to find that inner thigh stuff that would drive the instep of the foot down into the floor. Being careful not to lift this leg as we do it, because then we're losing the anchor and we're losing our pelvic anchor, which we want that anchor of this entire other side in order to create that isometric on this hip. You can also go the opposite direction by trying to contract this tissue again and trying to rotate this bone this direction and trying to imagine the foot on the instep getting light on the floor. So you're trying to rotate using this, find the tissue behind the pocket. It's crampy stuff, so you should feel some sensation of cramping in the back of the glute, and you're getting light on the instep of the foot, and relax. Now from here we can also do adduction and abduction as well. So you can imagine taking the entire shin bone, driving that entire shin bone down towards the ground, finding the inner thigh stuff that would do that. So driving the entire shin bone down to the ground, and then imagining trying to lift the entire shin bone off the ground, activating this tissue here on the side of the hip. So that's one action or one element of the 90-90 setup that I think people are missing or misunderstanding and not being able to get the most out of that hip setup. The second thing I think that people are neglecting to understand about the 90-90 setup is that the 90-90 setup is not ideal for everyone's hips. Some people need to start with other positions, and 90-90 doesn't necessarily work for every single human body. So what we can do is we can modify the 90-90 position in a variety of ways. One of the ways I like to modify the 90-90 position is by elevating the hips. The elevation of the hips gives a person a little bit more space and a little bit more room in order to set up in this position and get the things that they want out of the setup. So once you elevate the hips, you can use a box or something of that nature, and you can still find 90-90 in this position here. Just the hips are now elevated off the ground, so we're not super far into our end range. Maybe you don't have the ability to sit in such a position where the knee or the leg is in such a degree of external or internal rotation on this back leg. Or maybe in this position here, on your front hip, maybe you don't have a great degree of external rotation of the front hip, and it just places too much demand on the hip in being in that position where your leg is more parallel to the floor. So for me, for example, I'm able to sit in that 90-90 position pretty comfortably because not only is this position not giving me a stretch, but if you look at what I'm capable of lifting my leg further up into more degree of external rotation. So I have room here to actively contract, so that means that I can actually put myself in a greater degree of stretch because I have this range of motion already to be able to rotate a little bit further into external rotation. So the setups are going to work differently for different people, and giving people options and giving people ability to modify is going to be crucial in giving them the inputs that they need. Now this is going to work well, this elevated situation is going to work well for the internal and external rotation, not so much the abduction and adduction feature, but that's okay. The rotation is the fundamental movement of the joint anyway. So being in this position gives us the ability, if the person has found a stretch in the back of the hip and they're unable to lift off from here, it gives them the ability to now contract in this position, try and scoop and rotate into more internal rotation, so driving down into the floor, and then trying to rotate more into external rotation. In a situation like this, where I might have someone just starting, I might place a yoga block under their front foot and let them sit here. This is great because it takes off the demands on this back hip as well. So you're trying to get external rotation out of 90-90, but this back hip is just, it's too intense for them to be in complete 90-90. This takes some of the tension out of this back hip, and now you can focus solely on this front hip. Same thing goes for working internal rotation of the hip. When our front hip has too much demand for external rotation for our personal preference or our personal ability, we can now work in internal rotation here on the back hip from this elevated position because we've taken some of the demands off of this other hip. Remember, when we think about training and inputs, especially when we're thinking about two separate joints, when we're locked into a position, the demands are going to be different. So we're in a closed chain. I always talk to my clients, for example, who have issues with like one shoulder versus another shoulder, and whether we're going to do bench press with a bar, the limitation is going to be based on the limited shoulder. So if one shoulder has a limitation and you have a bar and you've closed the chain, then the ability of the other shoulder to get what you want out of it is going to be limited and constrained by the other shoulder. So we use dumbbells instead because the dumbbells give me the opportunity to let the shoulder demands be placed individually on each side. This is the same or a similar concept. Once you change the demands and change the limitation of the closed chain, so the limitation being this side, you now have access to be able to train this side without the limitation of this hip changing the demands and the requirements. The third and final thing that I see people doing with 90-90 that is slightly incorrect is not understanding the transfer from one side to the other. When we transfer from 90-90 from one side to the other, What I often see is people just moving side to side, like this. And that's fine. That's an element of movement that's great. We're moving the joints through the range of motion that you have, but we're not being very deliberate about it, and we're not intensifying or getting the most out of what we could be with that exercise. And it's fine, like I said, if I'm just having someone just move for the sake of moving the hips more, that's totally fine. But if I really want to ramp up those demands and get the most out of the movement, then I'm going to be a little bit more deliberate and specific and intentional behind the movement. So from here, for example, if I'm doing a 90-90 transfer to the opposite side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this back hip as much as I possibly can. So I'm trying to squeeze out as much as I can, and I'm driving this leg down against the floor as much as possible. So I want these two knees, the two inner parts of my knees, to be able to fight to be as far apart from each other as possible. So I'm opening up that back hip as much as possible, and I'm not turning my torso to go with it. I'm just focused on the hip. Now, once I've opened up as far as I can without lifting this leg off, at some point this leg needs to peel off the ground as well. So at this point I'm going to peel this leg slowly off the ground, but remember these two knees want to stay as far apart as possible. So I'm squeezing the stuff on the back side of both hips to drive them as far away from each other as possible as I transition towards the other side. I'm continuing to push these knees apart. I'm keeping the hips on the ground, driving apart as much as possible, keeping the torso as neutral as possible, just following along the movement. And as this front leg hits the ground, it's now driving against the ground, and this back leg comes over to join, and then I turn my torso with, and I can do my training from this side, or I can do my internal rotation work from this side, whatever it is that I'm going to do from this side. But remember, that 90-90 transition can be as deliberate and as intentional as you want it to be. It can be as intense as you want it to be as well. You can make it super slow. You can make a person fight as hard as they can to drive this leg down so that they squeeze out as much of the end range of this hip's ability as possible, and just increase that neurological drive. Once we increase that neurological drive and tension into the tissue, it's a learning opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to learn where your end ranges are and learn how much you can contract of that tissue. I hope that those three things helped you understand a little bit more about 90-90 and how you can do better with the activity and increase the opportunities for training stimulus in these movements. If you like this video, be sure to like it and share it with someone who enjoys doing 90-90. Be sure to subscribe and follow for more.